Hello, everybody, and welcome. My name is Tom Keating, and I am Director of RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here in London. It's my great pleasure to be the moderator of today's CFCS webinar, co-hosted with Standard Chartered Bank. This is the first of 3 webinars over the next few weeks we are organising together on the theme of financial crime and cyber security. I'm quite sure everyone is familiar with StandChart, but for those of you who do not know RUSI's Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, we established our program in 2014 with the aim of studying issues at the intersection of finance and security, including operational and policy responses to new and existing financial crime threats and challenges, such as the subject of today's webinar, detecting and seizing the proceeds of cybercrime, a topic that is growing rapidly in significance and has been a constant focus of our research work at RUSI in recent years. We will hear more about that work during today's webinar. If you'd like to know more about our work on this and other financial crime areas and want to stay in touch with our publications and events, do please follow us on Twitter at CFCS_RUSI and sign up to the CFCS mailing list that you can find via our website. So, for today's discussion on detecting and seizing the proceeds of cybercrime, I'm delighted now to introduce our speakers who will switch on their cameras to reveal themselves. Firstly, we're joined by Paul Taylor. He's the Regional Cybercrime Coordinator at the Northwest Regional Organised Crime Unit here in the UK. We're also joined by Anton Moisenko. He's a Research Fellow in our Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies here at RUSI, and importantly, together with Catherine Woods of StandChart, is the convener of this series of 3 webinars. Thirdly, we're joined by Becky Marriott. She's the VP Risk and Compliance and the MLRO, I always think 4 of the most dangerous letters in the world, at Tide. And finally, we're joined from Hong Kong by Stanley Wu, who's Head of Financial Crime Compliance for Standard Chartered in Hong Kong. So you're all very welcome. Thank you for joining us. I won't say anything more about their experience or their biographies. I'm sure we'll hear more about that when they come to their remarks. They will share remarks for 10 minutes each before we open the floor for Q&A from our online attendees. So again, do please be sure to ask your questions in the Q&A box as we progress. But before I pass the floor to our speakers, we want to run a couple of polls just to get a sense of people's interests. And I need to press the right button, which I've now done. Okay, I'm going to launch 2 polls. So if you could please give us your views on these 2 questions. What is your area of work? Just to get a sense of where you're from. And how confident are you in your organization's ability to detect the proceeds of crime? It's a confidential survey, so be honest. Okay, so we're getting some interesting results. So I think looks like everyone's more or less voted. So I will end the polling here. Hopefully you can see, so a big contingency of law enforcement, cheering on Paul, no doubt, 57% from law enforcement, few from traditional financial institutions, and then a reasonably confident audience when it comes to the ability to detect and identify the proceeds of cybercrime. So there you should see on the screen now. I've shared the results. So with that, I'm going to now pass the floor to Paul, who will give us his opening remarks and his presentation. So Paul, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Tom. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to listen to me over the next 10 minutes. Just basically talk to you about the policing perspective when it comes to detecting and seizing the proceeds of cybercrime. So my name is Paul Taylor. I'm currently the Regional Cybercrime Coordinator in the Northwest, which means I'm responsible for helping to manage the law enforcement response to cybercrime incidents in the Northwest and ensuring that we work effectively with our law enforcement partners to bring investigations to a successful conclusion. Prior to working in cybercrime, which I've done for around 6 years now, I was a detective in Greater Manchester Police Economic Crime Unit, mostly working in fraud investigation. So I've kind of seen the problem of financial crime from both perspectives of economic and cyber. In preparation for today, I started having a think about just how profit-driven cybercrime is. And what's important to note with policing is that we make this very distinct definition between cyber-dependent and cyber-enabled crime. So cyber-dependent crime, we focus primarily on computer-to-computer crime, typically offences under the Computer Misuse Act. Cyber-enabled crime tends to just be traditional crime that has been facilitated or upped in scale in some way because of computers and networks. When we look at the actual financial loss, don't know about yourselves, but certainly with me, some of the figures I find really hard to comprehend because they're just so large. But last year's figure of loss, which was estimated from the 23,500 cyber-dependent crime reports we got, comes to £40 million, which is probably a lot smaller a figure than you've probably seen published when we talk about the wider problem of cybercrime, which tends to incorporate cyber-enabled criminality. One issue we do have is around business reporting. We suffer massive underreporting from businesses. There was an estimate in a report last year that businesses who do consider reporting cybercrime externally, only 15% actually report to the police via action fraud. And we've kind of got this, what I call 80-20 problem, where the reality is probably 80% of the cybercrime in the UK is targeted towards businesses and 20% towards individuals. But when it comes to reporting, we see the complete flip side of that. So out of all that offending, how much is profit driven? Well, of course, we have issues with people we deem hacktivists and script kiddies who cause senseless damage to computer systems, and it's not necessarily financially driven. But in terms of the bulk serious crime that we're dealing with within cyber, a lot of it is financially driven. Our number one threat at the minute is ransomware, which is almost wholly financially driven. The profits that the criminals make are quite substantial, but pale into insignificance when you look at the disparate losses to the victims in terms of damage to business and loss of jobs potentially, which is something we're sadly seeing more of. Denial of service attacks against business services is often financially driven, and along with data extortion, we're seeing a lot more blackmail, very targeted attacks against businesses. It was just last week I was dealing with a case where a business basically had their website and email services stole from them in return for a payment in Bitcoin. The wider types of criminality we see, I don't think there's been a case in the last 12 months where we haven't found stolen payment card data on computers when we've done digital forensic examinations. That is still a massive cause for concern. And clearly, as you will see in a lot of the media reporting around it, dark web presents challenges for us in that some of the marketplaces are full online enablers for illicit trade. Cryptocurrencies, as they've grown in interest, they've also grown in their ability to be exploited by criminals. And the wider you look, the wider the problem is around profit-driven cybercrime. You can look at child sexual exploitation and the funding of terrorism. So it certainly is a challenge for us. One of the greatest challenges that is often talked about is the impact of the international side of things. When we're looking at an international investigation, which on the most part involves pretty much every cybercrime investigation we deal with, we have challenges because every country has different regulations and legal frameworks. And there are more everyday to-day challenges, such as the interpretation of what is cybercrime. It's not unheard of for us to receive a referral of crime from another country where they would expect a response from a specialist cybercrime unit. But due to the definitions and the way we record crime differently to that country, it may be that it doesn't fall in the remit of our specialist investigators and doesn't get the same attention it maybe deserves or would have been expected from the originating law enforcement agency. This all presents a lot of intelligence challenges for us. We have a lot of offending from outside the UK focused on UK victims, but then utilising money mules in the UK to then get them funds sent back overseas. And the way in which we enforce action around these investigations does affect our ability to gather intelligence and work out exactly how these criminals are operating and communicating. Needless to say, a lot of the traditional laundering methods we've seen in the past haven't gone away. Bank transfer into mule accounts is still very much one of the main ways in which high value frauds such as business email compromise are profited by criminals. We're seeing a lot of purchase of gift cards, vouchers, assets and services, particularly with stolen payment card information. If people can convert an individual's payment card details into a gift card or a voucher or some other goods that enable them to do further offending, they will do so. We had a recent conviction with Operation Garbs that involved who we'd probably traditionally class as your traditional fraudster, really, who's become a bit more technical, and he was using the funds he was making to purchase services and access to victim networks to do his offending from there, to obfuscate where he was actually coming from. And of course, we're still seeing, quite sadly, the abuse of remittance services to launder proceeds overseas on the back of scams such as romance fraud. The evolving methods, and I'm talking here about the kind of trends we're seeing over the last 6 months. So the recruitment of money mules and the methods by which criminals do that does change and evolve. And sometimes it's quite circular. They'll go back to traditional methods that have always worked for them. One thing we're seeing at the minute is social media accounts getting compromised. Nearly everyone's got at least 1 or 2 social media accounts. So they will compromise a social media account, contact their the victim's contacts and friends, and basically explain that they've got difficulties with the bank account. Please can they utilise their account to make a deposit? And the friends, wanting to be helpful, will allow that to happen and unwittingly become money mules. And that's something we've seen a lot of, particularly in the Northwest. We see continued trading of payment card data and other personal identifiable information. Data is very much money to a lot of the cyber criminals we deal with. And the purchase of assets, goods and services, similar to the case in OpGarbs. We see criminals purchasing things such as bulletproof hosting to obfuscate where their criminal offending is coming from and facilitate further cyber offending. One of the more concerning trends we've seen over the last 6 months, and I know my colleagues in Merseyside Police have done some really good work around trying to build up the intelligence picture around this, is around the abuse of newer electronic money institutions. So as we're seeing this move towards instant economy, fast payments, and new services that enable almost instant creation of bank accounts for payment purposes, we're seeing criminals exploit that. So, if, for example, there are many cases at the minute nationally causing quite difficulties around Facebook accounts getting compromised, and then people messaging the victim's friends, the suspects messaging the victim's friends to say, please can you send me money, I'm in hardship, I just need a few £100s. And of course, in the current COVID-19 crisis, people are willing to help because it sounds legitimate that people might be financially struggling, and they will send the funds. And at a single reporting level, the losses don't look like much, but when you actually start looking at the bank accounts behind these credits, they're making tens of thousands of pounds, and it's a really organised network of criminality. And of course, we see continuing issues with remittance and currency transfer services being abused, in particular cryptocurrency, which is kind of one of my specialist areas of investigation. For those who aren't aware, the sort of draw for criminals into cryptocurrencies are down to some key concepts and the way that they work. They're completely decentralized. Payments are peer-to-peer and nearly instant. There's no middle party or agency having to validate payments. Payments are instant and peer-to-peer. Fees are based on data, the size of the transaction and not the actual amounts. So you could have a case where sending £1 million is actually cheaper than sending £1, which is obviously against traditional remittance service providers. It can offer good levels of anonymity, and as we're seeing cryptocurrencies become more popular in the general population, we're seeing a greater increase in accessible services to cash in and out of the network, which just presents more opportunities for the criminals to get involved as well. One of the challenges we're starting to see is that criminals forming networks offline where they are quite happy to trade Bitcoin for cash at street level with no online interaction, making the challenge of tracing criminal payments very difficult. So I just want to share with you a really quick video. It's just an example of the kind of challenges we see when it comes to cryptocurrencies. This video is a video of myself and my colleague when we were doing some research some time ago, utilising a Bitcoin ATM to turn a £20 note into Bitcoin. It's just to demonstrate how easy it is. So we've gone to an ATM in a shopping centre in Manchester, armed with a Bitcoin wallet on our mobile phone. And all we do on the mobile phone is click receive Bitcoin, and I'll play the video. So the mobile wallet app presents a QR code, which is then scanned by the machine, inviting us to insert a banknote. There is then a conversion at a rate decided upon by that Bitcoin ATM operator. We agree to that rate and click send Bitcoins. And within seconds, the Bitcoins are then available on our mobile phone wallet, and we have dispensed of that cash. On that particular day when we made that recording, there was an individual in the queue we observed with several mobile phones, spent quite a bit of time at that ATM, seemingly put a lot of cash in there. Managed to identify who that individual was, and interestingly, he was already the suspect in a Greater Manchester Police romance scam that had amounted to a £50,000 loss to the victim. So we got involved with attending his home address when they executed a warrant, and found several Bitcoin wallet apps on there. He basically explained he was looking at other ways of sending money back home to his family, was his story in relation to that. So it's just a quick run through, like I said, from a policing perspective, and there are quite a few challenges presented to us. In terms of solutions, there certainly aren't any easy ones. For me, if you're asking me around how do we effectively detect and seize cybercrime proceeds, from a law enforcement perspective, I think we really need to focus on bringing our specialisms together. Due to national funding and the way that we work and our command structures, we have sometimes quite separate specialisms within economic crime and cybercrime. And I think you need the cybercrime practitioners and experts with their knowledge of how the technology works, how to seize assets such as cryptocurrency, to work with the specialists and experts in economic crime who understand fundamentally how criminals utilise money and launder proceeds of criminality such as cybercrime. So I think that the best opportunity we have is to try and do our best to bring them two worlds together. And that's something I continue to try and do. Okay, I think I'm probably at my 10 minutes, so I'll stop sharing my video and hand back over to Tom. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Paul. There's a specific question for you, which I'll come to at the end, but we might have a cross UK law enforcement link up already. So thank you very much for that overview. Depressing as ever, how far ahead of us the criminals are. Anton, we'll turn to you now, if we may.
Thank you, Tom. So the title of my presentation, which I'm about to share now, is Beyond the Mules and Crypto. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the evolving money laundering typologies and some of the less obvious typologies that we have seen as part of our research at RUSI on the proceeds of cybercrime. And I should preface this by saying that nothing that I'm about to say is to detract from the centrality of money mules and cryptocurrency for the cybercriminal landscape, but I'm conscious of the fact that we have other speakers today after me, Becky and Stanley, who will elaborate on some of what they're seeing at the front lines of money mule detection. And also we're going to have a separate webinar in this series that will focus squarely on the abuse of crypto and other new payment means. So I was going to talk about some of the other stuff. And of course, as researchers, we have the license to do a bit of horizon scanning and consider some of the less well-known money laundering typologies related to cybercrime. So if you have a look at the slide that I'm sharing at the moment, and you can hopefully all see, in addition to money mules and abuse of cryptocurrency, I like to think about 3 layers in total of genres of money laundering typologies related to cybercrime. One of those that we were particularly interested in as we did our research is misuse of companies and corporate accounts. So all of us will know that corporate accounts have long been presented as the best friend of organized criminals and corrupt politicians. But what about cyber criminals? What is the role of companies in the laundering of cybercriminal proceeds? And another issue that seemed particularly apposite to examine is the misuse of online businesses, either businesses that are set up by cybercriminals for money laundering purposes specifically, or businesses that are being unwittingly exploited by organized cybercriminal groups. So let's jump straight into this. The first thing to mention is that I think there's been quite a lot of evidence from various quarters and various jurisdictions that the abuse of companies and corporate accounts is a thing in the cybercriminal world, even though individual money mule accounts have perhaps received more public attention for good reasons. But there are a number of indicators that suggest that to launder significant amounts of money, including the proceeds of banking Trojans, cybercriminals do use corporate accounts. So for instance, that was the finding of Russian cybercriminal researchers in 2014, who looked at how people who were behind the Anonak Trojan moved around the funds that they obtained. And that group has some links to the Carbonac and Cobalt Trojans that wreaked havoc on a number of financial institutions around the world later on. There's also been an observation by the Belgian FAU in their annual report in 2017, which, thanks to the wizardry of Google Translate, we know refers to the recruitment of companies, and especially companies in trouble, financial trouble, by people who would ordinarily try to set up networks of individual money mules. So those companies would occasionally be targeted by people who want to channel the proceeds of cyber-enabled fraud. And the rationale for that is very simple, namely that you can move more money without arousing suspicion through a business account rather than an individual account of a student or another vulnerable individual whom you've duped into becoming a money mule. And finally, perhaps most interestingly for me, there was some evidence gleaned by Trend Micro from cybercriminal forums in Russia, or rather I should say Russian language cybercriminal forums, that suggested that cybercriminals often rely, or sometimes rely, on professional enablers in order to incorporate companies and use corporate accounts, and the rates can be eye-wateringly high. I have to say I was perhaps somewhat skeptical about this specific finding because of the somewhat sensational nature, but as it happens, in late March this year, there was a fresh affidavit submitted in a US court that was then published by a number of media outlets focused mostly on cryptocurrency, but also on cybercrime, that suggested that a Russian organized crime group was indeed actively using shell companies around the world, including in countries like the UK, in order to channel the proceeds of account takeovers and other cybercrimes. So that appears to be a sophisticated money laundering operation that involved both money mule networks, but also corporate accounts. So let me speak now about some of the implications of this for law enforcement. So just one more slide before I go to the implications for law enforcement. So another interesting thing that we have seen in the context of our research is the abuse of corporate accounts and companies also to receive payments for some of the services that cybercriminals provide to other nefarious actors. And that might seem to be somewhat counterintuitive, because you would not ordinarily expect cybercriminals to use the formal financial sector in order to receive payments, but there is some evidence of relatively unsophisticated DDoS attacks being facilitated by criminals who see the attraction of receiving credit card payments. And that is something that apparently increases the appeal of their services for a wider audience of relatively unsophisticated users. So this is something that we have heard also from law enforcement agents we have interviewed for the purpose of our research on cybercrime proceeds. And finally, there is an interesting nugget in one of the US indictments that speaks of a cybercriminal group that created a company to be able to pay salaries to some of the people who were engaged in that cybercriminal group under the guise of some sort of legitimacy. So now the implications for financial institutions, which I think are obvious in the sense that, first of all, the misuse of companies is not a phenomenon that is made up or overhyped or perhaps not even marginal in the context of cybercrime. And it follows inevitably that cybercriminals will seek to misrepresent the nature of their activities to the financial institutions that they are abusing for the purpose of receiving payments and channeling them onto money mules or otherwise using the proceeds of their activity. So one of the questions for financial institutions and the regulated sector is, how do you detect those businesses that are not actually doing what they claim to be doing? And on a related note, there is the question of how do they incorporate those companies? Who facilitates that? There is some controversy over whether money laundering facilitators that service the needs of other organized crime groups might also be engaged in the laundering of the proceeds of cybercrime, or potentially some of the mule herders who originally work on recruiting money mule networks then in a way graduate to the abuse of more sophisticated corporate structures. The US indictment that I have referred to, that was published in late March, seems to support the latter view. But once again, these are allegations only. They are as yet unproven in court. And now let me briefly reflect on the third upper category, which is the misuse of online businesses. Probably the most obvious typology here is not so much related to money laundering as it is to the monetization of stolen cards. So using stolen cards in order to purchase goods or services. And one of the features that can make an online business, especially a large platform, attractive for a cybercriminal is the ability to then move funds to someone else. So to move funds to someone who is an accomplice. So these are some of the headlines that you may have seen online. And I think the key point to make here is that we shouldn't rush to judgment and say that any particular business is vulnerable to, or uniquely vulnerable to, the exploitation by cybercriminals. What is probably much more accurate to say is that if you have the ability as a customer to purchase something online, and if there is an ability to easily transfer value to someone else using the same platform, then that can be a perfect storm that you would try to exploit. And all of those platforms fulfill those two characteristics just as a consequence of their business model, and therefore it is important for them to be able to do as much as they can to prevent the use of stolen cards. And the same goes for online gambling operators, who are frequently mentioned in the context of cybercrime. Once again, online gambling is a kind of online business where you can obtain services using cards, legitimate or stolen, and you can potentially imitate losses in a peer-to-peer game, such as online poker, in order to transfer value to someone. So once again, it's that perfect storm that doesn't reflect badly on the business itself necessarily, but just means that they have to be vigilant about preventing the abuse of stolen cards. And just one final observation before I close is that it's often said that online gambling operators are particularly frequently used to deposit the proceeds of cryptocurrency related crime such as ransomware. And here it's important to make the point that those are unregulated gambling sites that have very little to do with legitimate large operators that we all know of. So this is an entirely separate category of gambling, and we should always be mindful of that. But I'll stop at this, and thanks very much for your attention.
Great, Anton. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. Now we go from the academic to the practical, and turn to Becky Marriott for her remarks.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to be talking to you about a couple of typologies that we see in relation to what we're discussing today. And for those of you not aware, so Tide, we are a UK-based fintech. We offer business bank accounts for SMEs. So the first one that I'm going to be talking about is money mules. So like I said, we offer business accounts. So although you might traditionally think we are not as susceptible to money mules as maybe retail accounts are, we definitely do see them, as we've already heard today. The majority of the money mules that we see are often sole traders as opposed to our limited businesses. The individuals are young, normally sort of under 25 years old. We see a variety of the natures of business that they apply for the accounts with. So they include things like retail, textiles. They say they're personal trainers, they're selling things online. After they onboard, we see that they pass over the account or access to a second individual, or they attempt to do it. And that can be followed by things like a change of device, a change of phone number, a change of IP address. And we do see some links to students amongst those money mules as well. In terms of the transaction activity, we will see things like a tester payment, so maybe a zero value payment or a sort of a 1p payment, followed by quite often proceeds of fraud, proceeds of crime, so such as authorized push payment fraud. They would either move all the money out very quickly, or they will pay themselves a fee. So maybe they take sort of, £100 of the 1,000 and send the remaining £900 out to whoever is actually controlling the account or the mastermind behind the money mule. I think we've had a question in the Q&A about social media pages. We see there are very open pages on Facebook, for example, where people are recruiting for money mules or asking people to sell them their accounts, essentially. These ones are completely open. You look at all of their friends, and all their friends are doing exactly the same thing as well. This individual was actually advertising or requesting a Tide account, and you can see there's lots of photographs of cash, cars, they've got photographs of watches and all sorts of things. And also they do put screenshots of bank statements as well, saying this is what we want, this is how much money you can make. Quite stupidly, they put a picture of a Tide bank statement, and we were very easily able to identify who exactly it was behind it. But this is just one of the ways that the money mules are being recruited, basically using social media. So we have a specific typology at the moment, which is regarding DWP payments. So these are sole traders under 25 years old, unsurprisingly, all UK nationals. They are located in two specific places in the UK. So we see very common geographic areas there, and the postcodes are, are the same, the first part of the postcode. The accounts are predominantly open since March. We do have prior accounts since March, but the majority of the accounts are open since March. We see no genuine business activity on these accounts at all. And this network was flagged to us initially through our transaction monitoring. We do believe they're mules. They are the accounts are either taken over or attempted to be taken over by another individual after the account opening. There are, we believe, 2 individuals behind the network that are controlling the accounts. We see things like a change of device and IP, like I said earlier. And in terms of what the actual fraud looks like, they receive funds from DWP, sometimes multiple payments in one day, and then they move the money out very quickly from the account. And this BBC News article here is sort of speaks to this concerns about the values of benefit fraud at the moment. So in terms of what we did about it, we've reviewed accounts receiving more than one payment from DWP a day, because that shouldn't be happening. Accounts that have received payments fairly recently in the last few months, accounts over certain values and so on. We have been liaising with DWP around this. They are aware of this typology that we've seen, and we filed sort of the necessary reports as per our normal procedures. And we have seen that this has been successful. We've managed to deter the network. We're not seeing them continuing to onboard this particular money mule network. I'm sure they've been moved on elsewhere. And we do ensure that we liaise with our other fintech colleagues as well through the FinTech FinCrime Exchange to ensure that other people are aware of this typology, just to prevent the network just moving on to another fintech essentially. You may or may not be aware, but we are accredited to offer bounce back loans. And so our concern is definitely that this mule network would have then gone on to apply for bounce back loans with Tide. And there is a general concern amongst sort of the industry and the forums that we're on that money mules are being used to apply for accounts for bounce back loans through business accounts. So there's definitely something that we are on the lookout for as we are offering the bounce back loans. And just the second typology that I'm going to just talk about is around compromised cards. So compromised cards are where the bank cards are at risk of being used fraudulently. It's normally where there's been a data breach, a compromised merchant, a compromised payment rail, a compromised point of sale terminal. The card details are then able to be obtained fraudulently, and they are sold often online for people to buy those card details. The account holder is the victim. They are completely unknown, unaware that their account is being used or their card details have been, compromised and then sold online. And it's often, when they see the transactions they don't recognise, they realise something has happened. And the banks will reimburse the account holder if they are the victim, so they don't incur the fraud loss themselves. These are just a few examples of how these will happen. So most recently, EasyJet have announced, they had a big hack of data, including about 2,500 card details. But we see Ticketmaster, Monzo famously identified their breach there through looking at the compromised card data. So these are just some of the ways that we see card details being compromised. Just some stats on UK finance. So, we're in the hundreds of millions of pounds in terms of card payment fraud. And increasing year on year. We see more and more data breaches, more and more cards being sold online. So with it comes an increase in compromised cards. But I think the figure at the bottom is really great to see. So we're in the billions in terms of the amount of fraud that's actually prevented when it comes to compromised cards. And they're being sold on the dark web, closed forums and chat groups and so on as well. So what do we see at Tide? Well, when we've got compromised cards, we'll see a customer doesn't recognise a transaction, so they could come through to us and say, I haven't spent this money. Or we identify proactively that a card has been compromised. So that can be through things like seeing multiple declined transactions, transactions that look unusual for the particular customer, transactions that are on unusual hours. Again, we offer a business account, so it's quite unusual to have rapid card spend overnight, for example. There are also common merchants that we do see with compromised cards, which I'll come on to in a second. So we know that if we see a sudden change in customer transaction activity and some of these merchants have been used, it's highly likely that those are compromised cards. Like I said, the transactions are normally overnight as well with compromised cards. We see a tester payment, so normally a 0 value or 1p type transaction, followed by rapid spend with high value luxury goods. So we're going to now play along at home and guess some of the merchants that we see very commonly. So the ones we see very commonly with tester payments, Starbucks Reload. You at least, I don't know if you still can, but you could test that the card details actually worked, making a 0 value transaction with the Starbucks Reload. The bikes on the right, the orange bikes, those of you based in London will be familiar with these. These are bikes that you can rent, and Mobike was a very common merchant we saw. And interestingly, we saw laundrettes to do with on student university campuses. So hold on to that thought, because that one will come back in a minute. We then, after the tester payments, see very, very rapid spend, high value goods. So those of you on the left that are as familiar as I am with good old Selfridges. Selfridges is a very common merchant we see online spend with compromised cards, same with Harrods, Argos, Apple Store and so on. And always at the end of the night, they will order themselves a Domino's pizza. So we see very rapid, high value spend, followed by a big old pizza order. So Domino's pizza is definitely a commonality we see, which does lead us to believe that it's potentially, you know, sort of younger individuals and students that are behind this. So what we do when we see this is we will send a Data Protection Act request to the merchants that have received the order for the online payment, because we can get the name and the address if they do cooperate with the individuals purchasing those goods. Obviously, they're purchasing things online from the likes of Selfridges. They need to be sent somewhere. We then will investigate them and have a look at them. They're mostly unconnected, which again speaks to the theory that they are buying these details on the internet. However, we do definitely see commonality with students. So we've seen addresses being halls of residence, or when we look at them on a map, they live near university campuses. We can identify them sometimes on social media to know they're students. And if you think back to that tester payment on the laundrette at university campuses, we do definitely think that, you know, strongly indicates that they are, again, students behind it. And of course, the types of goods that they're buying, you know, things like designer handbags and high sort of Mac products, followed by or Apple products, followed by pizza, again, is not untypical for a student. So that's everything from me. I'm going to hand over back to you, Tom.
Becky, thank you very much. I will never look at my Domino's order the same again. In fact, I'm going to immediately stop ordering Domino's in case my bank account gets frozen. Becky, thank you for that. So lastly, we'll turn to Stanley, who is joining us from Hong Kong. Thank you again, Stanley. And just a reminder to attendees, we'll go to Q&A after this, so do keep them coming in the Q&A box. And in case you're worried that we're running out of time, we will be running until 1:15. So we'll have some good time for questions once Stanley has concluded. So Stanley, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So my name is Stanley Wu. Now it is working in the Financial Crime Compliance Department of Standard Chartered Bank Hong Kong. So earlier, Tom mentioned that Rebecca has a dangerous title on MLRO, and actually I am the MLRO for SDB Hong Kong as well. So I'm very delighted that I will have the opportunity to share the fraud investigation approach on the money mule account in particular, and share the what we have done in particular to the recent 6 months in order to tackle the money mule activities. So in the slide now in the screen, so you can see that it is the basic approach that we are adopting in order to detect the typology or the commonality of the mule accounts. So you can see in the top left corner there is a I3. So actually I3 stands for Integrated Intelligence and Investigations. So it is a particular department that SDB have, and to work with Financial Crime Compliance Department and to develop intelligence. Throughout our investigation and analyzing the activities of mule account, actually I3 help us quite a lot. So basically there are 3 stages. So the first one is to identify the actual mule account. So you can see that there are quite a number of ways that we will be actually being informed that it's an actual mule account is being taken place. So I think they are all quite self-explanatory. So I just want to highlight number 4. 4 is FIMLAT. FIMLAT stands for Fraud and Money Laundering Intelligence Task Force in Hong Kong. So it is basically the Hong Kong version of GMLAT in the UK. And now I think at this moment, of course, the FIMLAT is one of the major purposes is to share intelligence or share the methodology of various crimes that is being taken place in Hong Kong. And but I think at this moment, I think the FIMLAT the functions of GMLAT is much advanced than FIMLAT, because at this moment we still the information we are sharing is majority of the information is shared from the law enforcement. Okay, so at this moment we are still the information we can share among banks is quite limited. Okay, so once we have identified some confirmed mule case, and then the I3 in our bank will analyze the background. So now we will be actually looking into the static information, so such as the beneficial owner structure, the personal identifiers, such as phone numbers, addresses, and basically, I think from the beneficial owner structure perspective, for the mute accounts that we have identified, I think it is similar to what Becky's mentioned in his presentation. So what we have identified for the mute account, if we are talking about a corporate perspective, their beneficial owner structure is quite simple. So in most of the cases, they will be a single beneficial owner, and the same individual are the director and also the authorizing actuary as well. And the other identifier we I think to us so far it's quite effective is on the addresses. Because in Hong Kong, there are quite a number of corporate services provider who provide the company incorporation services. So we find that there are quite a number of mute accounts are actually coming from the addresses of the corporate service providers. So from that perspective, actually, what we are doing now is to for the new accounts that it's that is opened for in a corporate segment, we will conduct a address search to see whether those address used by the new accounts are actually actually the similar address being used by confirmed new entities. So I think on point 3, it is an online fraud detection tool. So doing this analyze and identification process, we also leverage on a tools that we have been using for fraud detection. And so by exploring the digital footprint of the clients that they have present. So for example, the IP addresses. So we will use that tool to see whether a confirmed mute account actually for example, the IP address, there are some other existing clients that they have the same, they exhibit the similar digital footprint. So and then the last one, the last action is the mitigation. So there are some enhanced controls that we have coming out. So for example, the address blacklisting and enhanced transaction controls. So that means if we have identified some clients with a higher risk mute account. So for every transactions that it is conducted by that a client will refer to the business or the FCC for approval before executing the payment. Okay, so I would like to mention about point number 5 on remittance payments double confirmation. So because in the recent 6 months, we identified that there is a increasing number of high value mute account activities. Okay, so we work with the I3 to come up with the set of existing clients that it's high risk from the mute activities perspective, and also that we will have an enhanced control in which for a incoming offshore payment that is over a certain threshold, we will send a message that is actually a SWIFT message to the remitting bank and asking them to confirm with the remitter to see whether there is a to see whether the payment is legitimate. Okay, so I think so far this this control is found to be quite effective because we are able to we have implement this control, I think, since April, and we are able to identify, I think, around 10 of the fraud account, the fraudulent payments. Okay, so I think this is the approach that we have been using. So I would like to highlight that actually this kind of this process will it is an ongoing process. And because the mute account activities or their characteristics will change from time to time, so this is an ongoing evaluation process. Okay, so to the next slide. So I think on this slide we will put a more focus on what we have done in the past 6 months. So as I mentioned, since Q4 2019, there were a few high-value fraud cases being identified. So to give you a ballpark figure, the amount, the total amount is up to 32 million US dollars. Okay, so the fraud types include phone deception, business email compromise, and SWIFT systems hacking. So you can see, as you can see, actually the upstream criminal activities are actually in most of the cases are cybercrime related. And the victims are located usually in Europe and the US countries, such as Germany, Norway, Argentina, and US. And basically in all of the cases, the victims are actually not the client of SEB. Okay. And the mute accounts are being opened in Hong Kong under this small to medium-sized enterprise. So that means because in Hong Kong, Standard Chartered Bank is actually one of the major banks in Hong Kong, and we are the non-issuing bank. So we have quite a number of branches all over Hong Kong. So we have certain branches that we will open for walk-in client to open the corporate accounts. So that means actually it facilitates the legitimate business for their to meet their financial needs, but it also facilitates the mute account activities as well. And as the speakers previously mentioned, in most of the cases, the high value fraud-related cases are related to mute account from for a corporate client, because first of all, I think they are, in most of the cases, they are relating to business email compromises, and in which the victim will be asked to divert the payment into other entities in other mute accounts. So if the account is a company, that will I think it will reduce the likelihood for the victims to raise suspicions. And also, most of the fraudulent funds stayed in accounts in Hong Kong are temporary. So it is, I think, similar to what Becky has just identified. And they are actually within 24 hours when the mute account receives the funds. So basically, they will dissipate the funds into other bank accounts in Hong Kong or other banks accounts overseas. So what we have identified so far is that actually the destination of the funds is from this mute account is not designated in Hong Kong. So at the end, they will send out of Hong Kong. Okay, so the measures to tackle mute accounts. So based on the analysis are done by the Ivory teams, actually we have some enhanced due diligence measures that to target a specific group of clients. So we will ask for additional information so to mitigate the CD risk. And also, after the account is being opened, we will have an ongoing review to look into their, as I mentioned, their static information, or the even for their cyber footprint, to see whether there's a high high suspicious of a mute account. Okay. So that's it's so far that is the brief summary of what we have done for in Standard Chartered Bank so far. And I just want to mention about a live successful case which happens in May. So for this, I think I would just mention, I would just want to highlight the importance of public-private partnership. So in May, we received a escalation from FBI. So in which they said that a school in US, which is a majority for grade 8 students, and they also offer financial aid for students, that is being, they are subject to the email compromise, and which they were being asked to send the funds into a mute account in SEB. So FBI escalate the case to us, and because I think when the victim reports the fraud to FBI, and FBI send the report to us, it is within a very short turnaround. So when we receive the information, so we take a swift response, and then actually we were able to stop the funds and then return back to the victim. So that's for that particular case, the amount is around $5 million US, which represents 25% of that school's annual operating budget. So I just want to mention that the mention of the importance of the public-private partnership, and also the timing of the reporting, for us to be able to recover the funds and then send it back to the victim. So the timing is very important. So I think this is all I want to present. So may I pass pass back to Tom?
Great, Stanley. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. So we've got some good time for answering some of the questions that have come in. So if our panelists can switch on their cameras again and rejoin us, as it were. I was going to come to Paul first, because he's been diligently trawling through the Q&A and picking out ones that he thinks he can answer. So Paul, I guess maybe starting with the question from, I think it's Keith Turner, a fellow law enforcement officer, who's just interested in understanding more about the intelligence work you've done in Merseyside regarding electronic money institutions.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. Cheers for the question, Keith. Around the intelligence work, it's quite challenging, really, because you're basically having to rely upon the information that the victims provided in a very brief narrative of what's happened to them. So the kind of work that Merseyside have done is look around victim typologies, recipient bank accounts, the type of banks and financial institutions that are facilitating this kind of crime, the method by which the criminals have committed the crime, and ultimately working with our partners such as the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau to identify any crimes that could be linked. But more than happy if you get in touch via police email, more than happy to discuss further if it helps at all.
Great, thank you. And Paul, while you're there, there's also a question from Paddy O'Hara at Standard Chartered about how we ensure, how law enforcement ensures that banks are informed to hold funds when they identify a fraud. And Becky, as a follow-up to that, I'd be interested to get your perspective on what's your experience in receiving information from law enforcement in those situations? So Paul, to you first.
Okay, cheers, Tom. The situation we've got in the UK at the minute in regards to reporting of such crime is that you would approach Action Fraud either via their online platform or phone. The report goes to the National Fraud Intelligence Bureau in the City of London, and then there's a bit of intelligence work done before disseminating that out to a police force or regional crime unit to actually look at some enforcement around that. So inherently with the system we've got, there are delays. So no doubt there probably are opportunities where we could maybe improve around that communication with the banks, particularly when it comes to fast time reporting of high value frauds. That said, the system we have got in the UK at the minute is really beneficial to allow us to collate like reports and reports when suspect bank accounts have actually been in receipt of funds from several crimes to ensure that it gets an appropriate and effective response from law enforcement. But there are the conversations two ways with regards to that. We get some extremely good intelligence from banks at times that allow us to act quickly. But yeah, the improvements could be made, but there are advantages to the system we currently have. I'll probably hand over to Becky.
Yeah, Becky, from your perspective.
Yeah, so we, I actually didn't mention it in my presentation, but we do, with the compromised cards, for example, we will report them to Action Fraud. It's just, unfortunately, it's such a lengthy process to report it and we don't really get anything back. So sort of to your point around reporting versus victims, that's definitely a barrier. We do get law enforcement inquiries. I wouldn't say an overwhelming amount related to the likes of money mules, but we do get them, and we do file our SARs where we think we have, proceeds of crime, obviously, and money mules. But I'd say generally, as with all things, the law enforcement inquiries we get, we don't always have a lot of information or context as to why they're making that inquiry to know what it specifically relates to. But yeah, we always welcome more information and context.
Okay, so I think one thing I've drawn out of what a couple of you have said is this whole kind of the risks around companies being abused for taking advantage of kind of COVID-related funds provided by governments and so on. So, Anton, I'll maybe start with you. It's always good to talk about Companies House in these situations. Are we aware of any initiatives that the government broadly or Companies House narrowly are taking to address what is clearly a risk, as Becky had highlighted?
Well, I think we all remember the stinging rebuke of Companies House towards all of the critics in the form of an 80-page consultation paper on what Companies House can do better, which is a clear demonstration that the problem has been acknowledged. I won't belabor the point because I think it probably deserves a separate conversation that is not limited to cybercrime, but clearly the current state of checks is basically non-existent. I think this is the consensus opinion, at least at the level of Companies House. And so in relation to the proceeds of cybercrime and other forms of money laundering through, for instance, online merchants, probably the more difficult and multifaceted question is, what do banks and payment processors do to ensure that they know that the business that is saying that they're selling t-shirts online is actually selling t-shirts rather than providing DDoS as a service? And there are a number of techniques ranging from usual open source investigations to test purchases. And I'm sure that people like Becky have probably amassed quite a lot of expertise in that in recent years.
Becky, do you want to come in there? I mean, how do you go about trying to identify, you're offering banking services to companies, many of whom are, I assume, registered at Companies House. So how do you go about dealing with the information quality challenge which we face?
Yeah, it's especially challenging for us because at Tide we do target new businesses. So a lot of our companies are, and our advertising is all geared towards the entrepreneur that wants to set up a business. From a KYC perspective, that's really challenging because we really have very little. We see they've just registered on Companies House, there's one director and shareholder, but that's, for the vast majority of our customers, completely legitimate. So we do, like Anton said, open source information, understanding, if the person set up a business selling shoes? Well, have they previously been in the e-commerce industry? Is there some information we can get previously on the customer? There's very little we often have to go off other than Companies House data for a brand new business. The things that we do look at, and now more than ever are really, really prevalent around the bounce back loans that I mentioned, are people purchasing businesses for the purpose of taking out bounce back loans. So we will look at things like change of director on Companies House, change of PSC on Companies House. So if that's recently changed and then they open a business with us, that's pretty potentially unusual and something we would want to dig into a bit more. So having that data on Companies House, albeit not checked and validated, is very useful for us. But it's definitely one of our KYC challenges.
Thanks. Stanley, coming to you, I think you mentioned that corporate service providers seem to feature heavily in these mule accounts that you uncover. So how do you go about providing services to corporate service providers when they seem to be such a central risk?
I think so. We have some official service providers, and in which they are referring clients to SCB for account opening. But for those corporate service provider, actually we are monitoring their the clients referred to us. So we will be monitoring the number of STRs they have filed. So we have a threshold. So we have an internal threshold being set up. So if the client referred by them on the number of clients if there are over a certain number of clients that is subject to STR reporting, that basically we will shut down those the corporate service provider, okay, in the official list. And I think the other one is about there are some corporate service provider which does not officially have relationship with us. So on that, we may come up with the actual mute accounts analysis. So if we find that there are some corporate service provider that is referred, maybe they are actually incorporating actual mute accounts for us, and then we have identified that they are actual mute accounts. We will put those names and address into our internal watch list. So when the new accounts coming in, if their address incorporation is the same as the corporate service provider, the address, so we will reject those new account opening applications.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to come back to the question of social media and social media companies. Everybody's whipping boy often. Paul, you sort of started highlighting the problems there, and Becky gave some very kind of concrete examples, mainly of people having their accounts hijacked, but it appears also that accounts are set up specifically to try and lure people to become mules. So could you just talk a bit more about that? And I'd be very interested, again, from both of you, what engagement do you have with the social media companies to A, make them aware of the problem, and B, how do they respond?
Okay, so with regards to that, it is correct that social media accounts will be used to promote and recruit money mules. We have seen it. There's a conviction we had a couple of weeks ago for computer misuse and fraud, where one of the things he'd done is actually use Instagram to recruit young individuals to drive around with him, enter banks and make cash deposits, etc. So it definitely does happen. The challenge is for us, we can't just conduct mass surveillance against open source social media to look for these things. So we really rely on reporting of these accounts and these posts. And then even then, when we get them, there are challenges around the authenticity of some of the criminals or other people posing as criminals. Sadly, on some of the accounts that we see, there'll be like stock images of cash being used for someone to just portray themselves as a mule herder or a cyber criminal, and they won't necessarily be criminal in their intent. They're just trying to sort of show a bit of bravado to friends, etc. So then when you've got them challenges built in, it's difficult for us to take up an investigation to delve further into who these people are and what they're trying to do and who they've communicated in. So we are very much reliant on reporting from partners and the public. That said, the public are quite good, to be fair. I think another challenge, but it's not a big problem for us, is the fact that the public will report to the social media providers, and the social media providers are getting increasingly better at responding and taking the accounts down. It just means that occasionally we possibly miss out on intelligence opportunities.
And Becky, your experience on that?
Yeah, so we would report them to the social media provider, Facebook in this example. But I think, like you say, Paul, a lot of them, it's not their real names and it's difficult to know who's actually behind them. We also would, in a SAR, for example, we would include that information in a SAR if we knew it came from a Facebook page, or if we had any exposure to that individual. So we would do it both those ways. I mean, the majority of, I think, our money mules, we don't identify them directly from a social media page, so it's not like it's the biggest source for us to really focus our efforts on. But we also will ensure, again, through forums like the FinTech FinCrime Exchange, that we let our, let other fintechs know about these pages, so they can also monitor to see if they see any accounts coming through that might have been bought or sold through the Facebook pages.
You've mentioned, Becky, the FFE, the FinTech FinCrime Exchange, a few times, which obviously is a great forum that you indeed helped set up for sort of exchanging information amongst fintech companies in London and now increasingly in other cities around the world. So I guess the last question I wanted to address was the one of information sharing, because when we think about cyber and financial crime, we are immediately, almost certainly, talking about cross-border movement. So I just was sort of go around all four of you, if I may, and just get your sense of how are we doing on information sharing on what is, by definition, cross-border crime. So Becky, I'll start with you, if I may. How do you feel? Where are the problems and what's working well?
Unsurprisingly, I think we could do a hell of a lot better, and we're always on the back foot. I mean, at Tide, we offer UK accounts only, so we don't have a lot of cross-border interaction, but certainly forums like the FFE are brilliant for exchanging typologies. We just miss that exchanging on the actual, individual level. So that becomes very tricky, but I think, as with always, there's more that can be done. And I would love to be able to share specific details with other firms and other financial institutions.
Stanley, maybe to you next.
Yeah, so because in Hong Kong, I think we have quite a strict regulations on the personal data sharing. So in most of the cases, even for private information sharing, it will be very, very limited. So I think from Hong Kong, as far as Hong Kong is concerned, I think there is a room for improvement on how we can share the information with other banks or other institutions in order to help them to tackle the criminal activities for a country as a whole.
Anton, thank you, Stanley.
Yes, so the view from the outside, it seems that there's a lot happening in this area. So there are quite a few information sharing partnerships that bear on the problem of cybercrime and money laundering. So from GIMLIT all the way to CISIP, which is the UK government-run information sharing partnership that is cyber-focused, and then groups like the Cyber Defense Alliance in the UK and CFTA in the US. So I think there's a lot happening, and there is a lot of appetite to understand what exact kinds of information are helpful and how they can be best used. And from speaking to people in the know, it seems that one of the challenges is that if you rely especially on third parties to do part of your analysis for you, for example, linking related accounts and doing all that kind of stuff, then in a way you get the results from your third-party service provider, but you don't necessarily know what information is being used, what more information you could use for those purposes, because it's not necessarily you within the institution who's doing that analysis. So I think I would just throw out those two observations about the proliferation of partnerships and the challenge of knowing what information you need.
Great, thank you. And Paul?
I think when it comes to intelligence sharing, both internationally and domestically, there have been massive improvements, particularly with cybercrime and the financial harm that's caused by it. We lean heavily on our good relations with law enforcement partners internationally, and that has improved in recent years because we're able to reciprocate better and better through the governance that we've now got in relation to cybercrime investigations within the UK. We've truly now got a national, regional and local response to cybercrime, which enables us to facilitate them requests from partners internationally. That said, there's a long way to go. I think, again, we would love to be doing a lot more with the financial industry, academic partnerships, and there's definitely more work to be done. But yeah, loads of really good improvements, and I'm only seeing a trend towards that increasing.
Good. Unfortunately, as we know, the criminals move faster than we do. There is actually one question which I think gets the prize of best question that we've received on a RUSI webinar during lockdown, which I'm going to try and answer, which is straight after this webinar, I'm doing a cyber webinar for young people aged 30 and upwards, which covers cybercrime. What tips should you give them? And I'm going to say, what tips should you give them as relates to certainly the risk of becoming a money mule? And I guess it's when people offer you money for no good reason, then you need to be suspicious and avoid at all cost engaging with that kind of opportunity, Malcolm, in answer to your question. But anyway, we're going to have to wrap up our discussion here. It's 1:15 the hour as advertised. Hopefully we've managed to address many of the questions that you all have asked. The good news is that if you want more of this kind of webinar, then this is just the first of a series of 3, as I mentioned, that we are co-hosting with Stan Chart in this field. The next webinar is on the 22nd of June and will address new methods of payment and financial crime. You can find the registration details on the RUSI website, so please look out for those and sign up. And if you're on our mailing list, you should have received those already. But with that, I'd like to thank Becky, Anton, Paul and Stanley for their contributions today. Thank you to you, our audience, for joining us and for your questions. And finally, thanks to the RUSI events team and to our CFCS program manager, Alana, who've been the technical and organizational masterminds behind the scenes for us today. So until next time, I've been Tom Keating. Stay well and thank you all for joining us and have a good day. Bye for now.